Maybe you're here today and you're thinking, well, baptism, I've never done that. Or maybe you're thinking, well, that's something that is kind of stirring me a little bit. I'd encourage you to consider it, prayerfully consider. Maybe that's something that God is putting in your heart for this season. And baptism, you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to have life perfectly put together. Baptism is really about Jesus. It's about saying, Jesus forgives me. Jesus rescues me. Jesus saves me. Jesus, he leads me. And that's where we're going today. We're going to look at what it means to follow Jesus, even when life doesn't go according to our plan. I'll give you an example. I had a problem. It was an outdoor wedding. So the bride was there, the groom was there were a couple of hundred guests there, and I gave a short welcome, and then I gave a brief message. It was time for the vows. And I opened my mouth, at that very precise moment, this little guy, Fly, decides to buzz right on in. I kid you not, Fly in the mouth, right in the middle of a wedding. That is not in the pastor's handbook. What do? Pray for deliverance? Gag? Thought about, should I just spit him up and hack him out right there at the altar? What do you think I did? Hold on to that thought. Crossing over. Following God into the unknown. We're teaching through this Old Testament book of Joshua. Today we get to chapter 3 and 4. It starts out this way. Joshua chapter 3, verse 1. Early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim and went to the Jordan, where they camped before crossing over. Sounds like no big deal to us, but that was actually a problem. And no, Joshua's problem, it wasn't a fly in the mouth. His problem was a river to cross. See, the promised land, it was on the other side of that river. And in those days, no bridge, no ferry. There wasn't even a little guy in a canoe to paddle him across. So what did Joshua do? Verse 5. Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. Okay, like the optimism, Joshua. But can you give us a few more details? Yep, he does. Verse 13. He says, and as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap. Notice something here. Notice that is not present tense. That is future tense. That means that wasn't fact. That was faith. We see right out of the gates in chapter 3, Joshua, this guy had faith. He had big faith in God. And why wouldn't he? I mean, just think about Joshua. Just think about his life. Just think about what this guy had actually experienced. A lot of the stories we read about in the Bible, he lived through them. I mean, an example would be the Passover. The original Bible Passover, the people of Israel, they were slaves in Egypt. And God, he had sent Moses to go to the Pharaoh to say, thus says the Lord, let my people go. Pharaoh said, no. Well, 9 plagues of judgment later, we read this. Exodus 11, verse 4, Moses said, this is what the Lord says. About midnight, I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die. From the firstborn son of the Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn of the female slave who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. That's bleak. That's a pretty bleak passage in the Bible. But we also get this. There was hope. There was one exemption. The blood of a lamb. chapter 12, verse 13. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. That's where we get the name Passover. It comes right here from that verse. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt, saved by the blood of the Lamb. That's the Passover. By the way, anybody know what day Jesus was crucified on the cross? It was the Passover. Same day, years later. Coincidence? No. See, that's God's way of saying Jesus was the fulfillment of the Passover. The Passover, the Old Testament, it was pointing toward him. Well, Joshua didn't just hear about the Passover. And Joshua, he didn't just read about the Passover. Joshua, this guy, he experienced the Passover firsthand. He was there. And did you also know this? Joshua, he happened to be the firstborn child in his family. What does that mean? That means this. Joshua didn't just experience the Passover. Joshua, he was personally saved by the Passover. Joshua, his life was literally spared by the blood of a lamb. So Joshua, look at his story. Look at what he's experienced in his life. Joshua, he had good reason to have big faith. He had experienced God's provision personally. Chapter 3, verse 14 and 15. So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. You know, when Joshua and company stood on the brink of the Jordan, I imagine he thought something along the lines of, I've been here. I've done this. God has already done this. He's thinking 40 years ago, the original Exodus with Moses. Joshua, this guy was there. The Passover, it had passed over. They were out of Egypt. They were free. They were celebrating until they ran into a dead end. To the north, massive Egyptian military fortress. To the south, blazing desert. To the east, most powerful army in the world, the Egyptians. To the west, the Red Sea. They were trapped. No way out, no hope. What did they do? Moses says these words, Exodus 14, verse 14. He says, the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. People, they did nothing. Why? Well, maybe they did nothing because they had this guy on their side. You know, they had Moses, and Moses could do some things, right? Little Moses didn't want to take a bath. I think that's kind of funny. I also think it's wrong. There's this general misconception that a lot of people have when it comes to what happened with the parting of the Red Sea. When you think about that part of the Bible, when you think about the parting of the Red Sea, what visual do you have in your mind? Because anybody you think of something along the lines of this, got this image of a heroic Moses. He's got his staff raised and the waters of the sea going whoosh, whoosh. You know, that's dramatic, and that's also inaccurate. What is? Look at the Bible. Look at it closely. Exodus 14, verse 21 and 22 says, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Did you catch what they did? Well, how about this? Did you notice when that happened? All that night. All that night. In other words, that happened, the Red Sea parting, that happened while they were sleeping. While they were sleeping, God was working. The only one who had to lift a finger was Moses. And what did Moses do? Well, all Moses did was raise a staff. See, Moses didn't part that Red Sea. God did. What did Moses do? Moses went to bed. That's what Moses did. So by the time we get to this passage, Joshua chapter 3 and the Jordan River, recognize Joshua, he has seen God do some pretty amazing things. He already had faith. He had big faith in God. Why? Because he had already seen and experienced God's provision and God's faithfulness firsthand in the past. So I think one of the things God's doing in this passage is inviting us to ask a question, well, how about me? How is my faith in God doing today? Joshua, his faith was big, it was strong. How's mine? Right now, you're at a place internally where you say, I have peace. Or are you experiencing some anxiety? Maybe some fear or some turmoil. Because one of the best ways to build our faith is to do what Joshua does right here in Joshua chapter 3. What he does, he looks back. This is God's way of saying to us, faith isn't something that God just expects us to pull out of a hat. Faith is built on experience. It's based on personal experience. Look back, remember, recall. So let's take a moment to do this together. Let's do what Joshua was doing when he was standing right there on the bank of the Jordan River. He took a moment to look back. So let's start with this one. Think of a time in your life, just one time, a time in your life when you were facing a challenge. And not one you're currently in, one that's already passed. Think about one, a big one, a difficult one. And now here's what Joshua does with that. Look back at that. Look for God. Where was God? What was God doing? How did God provide for you? How did God use that to shape you? Just personal life experience. How about this one? Think of a time when you were in a dark place. Got it? Now look back, look for God. Did you experience God? Was he with you? Was there a way that God protected you? Was there a way that God rescued you? Where was God in that moment? Or let's try one more. How about this? A time in your life, think of a time in your life when you were facing a really key decision, an important one, a big one. You knew the stakes were high. Got a moment like that in your mind? Now, look back, reflect, and ask yourself, well, where was God? What was God doing? How did God, in that moment in my life, how did he guide me? Because here's what that does. When we do that, what we recognize is God. He's not just a name and stories that we read in a book. God has been personally, firsthand involved in my life. He's been there in good times and bad times. I've experienced his provision. I have experienced his faithfulness. He hasn't abandoned me. He hasn't ignored me. He hasn't shortchanged me. The God who has been faithful to you in the past, he will be faithful to you in the present. Wherever you are, whatever you're facing today, you're facing a difficult decision, or maybe you're in a challenging situation, or maybe something just hurts. Don't just fixate on the present. Remember God's provision for you in the past. The God who was faithful to you in the past, he will be faithful to you in the present and in the future. Hang on to that, because that's where peace is found. Well, Joshua chapter 3, verse 14 says, the people broke camp to cross the Jordan. Now try and imagine what it'd be like to be Joshua in this moment. Joshua, he's standing on the brink of the Jordan River. Promised land is on the other side, and he remembers the Red Sea. He remembers, oh, I kind of have been in a situation like this. He remembers Moses pulling out his staff and waving it. And then he remembers, oh yeah, Moses, he went to bed. And when he woke up, voila, he had his miracle. So that's in Joshua's mind. Now what did Joshua do? Take a look at this. Chapter 3, verse 5, Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. So Joshua, he's got the Red Sea in his mind. He's got how it worked with Moses in his head. He believed, he had faith. He gave the people a little pep talk, and then he hit the hay. He went to bed. Guess what Joshua discovered in the morning? Nothing. No miracle, no provision, no dry ground. Joshua believed, but that river, it didn't part. It was still flowing. So he's got to be thinking, well, what now? What next? Well, let's ask God. Verse 13, God says this to him. He says, as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap. Did you catch it? God said, Joshua, you got to take a step. Joshua, you got to get your feet wet. Joshua, get on in there. You know, I read a passage like this and I think, man, try and put myself in Joshua's place. And I think if I was Joshua, I think I'd have a few things to say to God. And I think one of them would be along the lines of this. I'd be like, God, seems like there's a little mix up in the miracle department. You know, Moses, he got the part first, walk second package. Looks like I've got the walk first, part second passage. I'd like to have a little exchange here. I want the Moses miracle package. Moses, his miracle began looking at dry ground. Mine began with wet feet. Not fair. Not fair. That's not fair. Moses didn't have to do that. And that's correct. Joshua was right. Moses didn't have to do that, but Joshua did. And then there's the Jordan River. What do you know about the Jordan River? You know where the name comes from? The name Jordan River, it's a Hebrew word that means this. It means descender. Descender. Why would someone name a river with the word descender? Well, here's why. Because the Jordan River goes deep. The Jordan River descends further deeper into the earth than any other river on the planet, 430 yards below sea level. And the Bible goes on, tells us this, verse 15 in Joshua 3, now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. So historians, they look at this passage, Joshua chapter 3, and they'll tell us that the Jordan River, it was at flood stage, which means at that time it probably was 100 yards wide. That's an entire football field. And then it was 40 feet deep. That's a lot of water. That's a lot of river. And you better believe that first step was going to be a doozy. Here's what happens with Joshua 3. A lot of people will get to Joshua 3 and they're like, oh, I know this story. This is familiar. We had the same thing happen back in Exodus 3 with Moses and with the Red Sea. We know this one. Well, actually, that's not true. Exodus 3 and Joshua 3, there's a difference. There's a big difference. There's a very important difference between these two. Exodus chapter 3, the parting of the Red Sea, well, it started with God parting the Red Sea, first thing, right out of the bat. And then once the sea had already parted, they could clearly see the safety of the dry ground. That's when they walked through. That's not this. That's not Joshua chapter 3. Joshua chapter 3, the river hadn't parted. The water was still flowing. This, Joshua chapter 3, this was harder. This, Joshua chapter 3, this would require more faith. I think God was expecting to see a little bit of faith development. It's God's way of saying, if you want to see the river part, first, you got to get your feet wet. First, you got to take a step. Joshua chapter 3 is God saying faith is not standing on the bank waiting for your miracle. Faith is not having a Bible that sits on your shelf. Faith is not standing in this room and singing worship services in a really safe environment. And faith, it's not having all the answers at the Bible study. And faith, it's not waiting until all the risk is gone. And faith isn't praying, hey, God, lead me, and then giving him very specific details on where you expect him to lead. Faith is getting your feet wet. Faith is taking a step. So I had a problem. It wasn't a river problem, it was a fly problem. The wedding party, bride was there, groom was there, a couple hundred people were there, and that moment, zippity zip zip, this fly darts right into my old pie hole. So what do you think I did? Prayed? No. Do you think maybe I hacked him up and spit him out? Nope. I'll tell you what I did. I took a step. I got my feet wet. I mustered every ounce of courage I had, and I swallowed. Yeah. I swallowed that fly in the name and for the glory of Jesus. And today, every time sometimes you hear this psalm from 34:8, it says, taste and see that the Lord is good. Makes me squirm every single time. Well, Joshua chapter 3, verse 15 and 16 says, as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away. And in chapter 4, what they do, they got the dry ground in the Jordan. They go back into the Jordan River. On this dry ground, they find some rocks. And then they take these rocks and they bring them to the bank and they stack them up, 12 stones, one for each tribe. And you think, well, why would they do that? That was hard work. Those were heavy stones. Why would they take the time to do that, to stack them up? What's this saying? What's this about? And it was like most of the chapter, most of Joshua chapter 4, you think that's not the most interesting chapter in the Bible. They're just stacking up rocks. Well, there's a reason why they're doing that. They are doing that to remember. Chapter 4 is all about remembering chapter 3. See, every time that they saw those stones, every time they walked by that place, well, they remembered. They remembered what God has done. Every time maybe a kid said, hey, what are those stones doing over there? Well, they told the story. The stones, that was a way for them to remember God's faithfulness, to remember God's provision. And it's God saying to us, remember the past. Remember my faithfulness. Remember my provision to you in the past, because that's important. That's valuable. Remembering God's faithfulness in the past increases our faith for the future. Here's how this passage ends. Chapter 4, verses 17 and 18. So Joshua commanded the priests, come up out of the Jordan. And the priests came up out of the river, carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord. No sooner had they set their feet on the dry ground than the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and ran at flood stage as before. Do you see what God is saying through this passage? I think he's saying faith isn't just standing on the bank waiting for your miracle. Faith is getting your feet wet. Faith is taking a step. In the book of Joshua, the provision did not come before the faith, right? The provision came after the faith. God didn't open the river when he saw their need. God opened the river when he saw their faith. Faith first, provision second. Sometimes you and I sometimes we got to take that first step. So how does that apply to your life and your situation today? I don't know, there's a lot of different ways that could apply. Maybe you're facing a challenge at the workplace. Have faith. God hasn't left you. God hasn't bailed out on you. Have faith and also take a step. Think, right? You use your brain. Develop a plan. Consult with a colleague. Do some research. Take a step. Or maybe you feel distant or disconnected from God. Well, have faith, but also prioritize Him. Take some time to say, I'm just gonna pause the busy. I'm gonna pause all the stuff that's taking place and going on right now. I'm gonna spend some time just being with God, just sitting with Him, just listening for Him. I'm gonna lean into some spiritual disciplines. Take a step. Or maybe you feel lonely. Happens, there's a lot of that around. Well, have faith, but also get involved in something. Get involved in something where you're going to be able to meet some other people. Take a step. Maybe you're facing a weighty decision today. Ask God for guidance. Certainly pray about that and do some research. Consult some wise people. Take a step. Joshua 3 and 4, as I've been kind of living with this one and see how does this apply to my life, I've been a little bit convicted because I think I kind of expect God to part my river before I take a step. And if He doesn't, I can get a little bit grumpy. I could start questioning Him. Like, God, what's going on here? God, why is this happening? God, what are you doing? I can question. I want to see the miracles. I want to experience His provisions. I want to experience His blessing. But I don't want to have to touch the water. But I don't want to have to step out in faith. I prefer that God provides safe ground while I'm just sitting on the bank. But that's not really faith. Faith is getting your feet wet. Faith is taking that step. Faith. God doesn't ask us to conquer Egypt. God doesn't ask us to part the Red Sea. God doesn't ask us to win every single battle, but He often does ask us to get our feet wet, to take a step of faith. What's your Jordan River today? Maybe a challenge, a hurt, a decision. Have faith and also take a step.